I will inherit the house, the $1 million fortune, and the director's position, said my daughter-in-law, Betty, upon hearing that there was a lawyer for George's inheritance proceedings. Betty couldn't hide her joy. She entered the room as if she owned the place. The same woman who had always pressured with questions like, "What's going to happen with the inheritance?" Or, "Isn't it settled yet?" She must have been eagerly waiting for this day. As she ignored me and approached the lawyer seated in front of her, I wondered what had made my late son marry this woman. When she turned her back on me and approached the lawyer, I couldn't help but feel emotional, wondering what she would say next. The gray sky seemed to cry with me on that fateful morning. The raindrops mingled with my tears as I prepared for the moment no mother should ever face, the funeral of my only son, George. My hands trembled as I buttoned up my black coat. Each movement was a painful reminder that my boy was no longer here. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the relentless ticking of the clock George had given me last Christmas. Arriving at the church, my heart clenched at the sight of the casket. There lay my George, so still, so pale. I touched his cold face, remembering when he was just a baby in my arms. "Barbara, you need to be strong," I whispered to myself. It was then that I noticed, amid the murmured condolences and stifled sobs, I heard a voice that stood out. It was Betty, my daughter-in-law, whispering excitedly with some relatives. She's not even crying, I thought in disbelief. I approached, expecting to hear comforting words or cherished memories of George. But what I heard chilled me to the bone. "What about the will?" Betty was asking, her eyes shining in a way that had nothing to do with tears. "Do you think he left everything to me?" I was paralyzed, unable to believe what I was hearing. How could she be thinking about money at a time like this? One of George's aunts, horrified, replied, "Betty, for God's sake, this isn't the time." But Betty interrupted her. "No, Aunt. We need to be practical. George is gone, and someone needs to take care of the business." I could no longer contain myself. With heavy steps, I approached the group. Everyone fell silent when they saw me, except Betty, who had the audacity to smile. "Oh, Barbara, dear, we were just talking about—" "I know exactly what you were talking about, Betty," I cut her off, my voice trembling with rage and pain. "And since you're so eager to know, I'll tell you. George left everything to me and Laura. You won't get a cent." Betty's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of shock and then barely contained fury. But that's not possible. I'm his wife." "You were his wife," I corrected, feeling each word like a stab to the chest. "And from what I see, George knew exactly what he was doing." I turned my back on her, unable to bear another second of that conversation. As I walked back towards my son's casket, I heard Betty start to argue furiously with the others. But her words were lost in the whirlwind of my own grief. "George, my love," I whispered, touching his cold face once more. "What happened to you? What did she do?" In that moment, as the tears flowed freely down my face, I swore that I would uncover the truth. For George, for myself, and for the justice my son deserved. The days following George's funeral passed in a foggy blur. I wandered through the house like a ghost, touching his things, smelling his scent on the pillows. Each object was a memory, each memory a stab to the heart. It was on one of those melancholy afternoons that I found the box. Hidden in the back of George's closet, it contained a stack of medical documents, unused prescriptions, and notes in his shaky handwriting. My heart raced. Here was the story of my son's last months, written on hospital and clinic letterheads. I spent hours poring over those papers, my eyes burning with tears and disbelief. The truth that emerged was more painful than I could have imagined. George could have been cured. The treatment was there, prescribed and detailed, but neglected. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone and called Dr. Simmons, George's oncologist. "Barbara, what a surprise," he answered, his voice tired but kind. "How can I help you?" I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "Dr. Simmons, I found George's medical records. Why wasn't the treatment followed?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with regret. "Mrs. Barbara, I tried. I insisted with George and Betty countless times. The treatment had a good chance of success, but what?" I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. Betty always found an excuse. She said it was too expensive, too painful for George. I explained that the benefits outweighed the risks, but she seemed to have made the decision for him. It felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. Betty knew. She knew George could have lived, and yet, I thanked the doctor mechanically and hung up. My mind was in turmoil. I needed to confront Betty, to hear it from her. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, she showed up at my door, dressed all in black, her eyes red more from irritation than grief. "Barbara, we need to talk about the will," she began, barely stepping over the threshold. I ignored her words. "Betty, I know about George's treatment." She froze, her eyes widening for a moment before narrowing. "What are you talking about?" I shoved the documents toward her. "George could have been cured. Why didn't you let him?" Betty grabbed the papers, flipping through them quickly before tossing them back onto the table. "This is ridiculous. He was already doomed." The coldness in her voice shocked me. "How can you say that?" "He was your husband," she shrugged, a gesture so casual it made me nauseous. "George was suffering. I just wanted it to be over quickly." "Quickly or conveniently? You wanted the inheritance, didn't you?" Betty's eyes flashed. "Careful what you're implying, Barbara." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it plainly. You let my son die for money." Betty stood abruptly, her face a mask of fury. "You can't prove anything. And if you think you're going to cut me out of that will, you're sorely mistaken. I'll fight for every penny that's rightfully mine." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving me alone with my pain and my anger. I looked at George's photo on the wall, his smile forever frozen. "And don't worry, my son," I whispered. "Mom will see justice done, even if it's the last thing I do." Autumn arrived, painting the trees in shades of red and gold, but for me, the world remained in tones of gray. Each day brought a new onslaught from Betty, each one more desperate than the last. On one particularly cold morning, I heard insistent knocking at the door. When I opened it, there she was, Betty, her eyes shining with a mix of determination and desperation. "Barbara, we need to talk," she said, pushing her way inside without waiting for an invitation. I sighed heavily, closing the door. "What do you want now, Betty?" She turned to me, her face a mask of false concern. "I've been thinking, Barbara. George wouldn't want us fighting like this. He loved both of us." My stomach turned at her hypocrisy. "George loved you, Betty, and you let him die." Her eyes narrowed for a moment before softening again. "You don't understand. I did what I thought was best for him. But now we need to think about the future, about what George would want." "And what do you think George would want?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Betty smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He'd want us to share, Barbara. Half the inheritance for each of us. It's fair, don't you think?" A wave of anger surged through me. "Fair. You talk about fairness after what you did." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Think carefully, Barbara. I was his wife. I have rights. If you don't cooperate, I can make things very difficult for you." I met her gaze, feeling a strength I didn't know I still had. "You can try, Betty, but you won't get anything. George made it very clear in the will." Betty's face twisted into a scowl of fury. "You'll regret this, Barbara. I'm not giving up that easily." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving only the echo of her threat. In the days that followed, Betty tried everything. Phone calls, emails, she even sent a lawyer to try and intimidate me. But I stood firm. Each of her attacks only strengthened my resolve. One afternoon, while I was flipping through an old photo album of George, the phone rang. It was Laura, my sister. "Barbara?" Her voice sounded worried. "Are you okay? I heard Betty's been pressuring you a lot." I felt a lump in my throat. "I'm handling it, Laura. Don't worry." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You know, maybe we should consider giving her something. Just to end this once and for all." I was shocked by Laura's words. "How can you say that? After everything she's done." I know," Laura replied quickly. "But think about it, Barbara. All this stress isn't good for you. Maybe a settlement?" "No," I cut her off, my voice firmer than I expected. "I'm not giving her a single cent, Laura. This is all that's left of George. It's the last thing I can do for him," Laura sighed. "All right, Barbara, just take care of yourself, okay?" After hanging up, I sat for a long time, staring at George's photo in my hands. His smile, so full of life, seemed to give me strength. "I won't give up, my son," I whispered to the photo. No matter what happens, I'll honor your memory. I'll see that justice is done for you." And in that moment, alone in my living room with only the memories of George as company, I made a silent promise. Betty could try whatever she wanted, but she would never win. The truth and justice would prevail, even if it was the last thing I did in this life. Winter arrived, and as I watched the snowflakes slowly falling outside the window, I remembered how much George loved building snowmen as a child. The pain of his absence was a constant weight on my chest, but I had learned to bear that burden. The sound of the doorbell pulled me from my thoughts. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see Laura standing there, her face a mix of anxiety and determination. "Barbara, we need to talk," she said, quickly stepping inside and shaking the snow off her coat. I followed her to the living room, a sense of apprehension growing in my stomach. "What's wrong, Laura?" "You look worried." Laura sat down, wringing her hands in her lap. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Barbara, Betty came to see me." I felt my body tense. "What did she want?" Laura looked away, appearing uncomfortable. She made me an offer. She said if I helped her get into the will, she'd give me a portion of her inheritance. I was shocked, unable to believe what I was hearing. "And what did you say?" Laura finally met my eyes, her expression serious. I pretended to agree. "Barbara." "What?" I exclaimed, abruptly standing up. "How could you?" "Wait, let me explain," Laura said quickly, reaching out to calm me. I pretended to agree so I could find out what she's planning. "Barbara, she's desperate. I think she might do something drastic if we don't stop her." I sank back into the couch, my mind reeling. "What exactly did she say, Laura?" My sister sighed heavily. She talked about contesting the will, claiming George wasn't in his right mind when he made it. She even mentioned forging some documents. A wave of nausea hit me. "This is madness. She can't do that." "She can try, Barbara," Laura said softly. "That's why we need to be prepared." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging over us. Finally, I looked at my sister, feeling a mix of gratitude and determination. "What do you suggest we do?" Laura leaned forward, her eyes shining with an idea. "What if we use this against her? We could record our conversations, gather evidence. If she really tries something illegal, we'll have what we need to stop her." A shiver ran down my spine. It felt wrong, almost dirty, to use such low tactics. But then I remembered George's face, the life he could have had if Betty had cared enough. "All right," I finally agreed. "Let's do it." In the weeks that followed, Laura and I became amateur detectives. Every conversation with Betty was carefully recorded, every email saved. It was during one of these recorded conversations that Betty finally showed her true colors. "You don't get it, Laura," she said, her voice a mix of desperation and anger. "I dedicated years of my life to George. I deserve something in return." "But Betty," Laura responded, keeping her calm, "don't you think you're going too far? Forging documents is a crime." Betty laughed bitterly. "A crime? The real crime is how I'm being treated. Barbara isn't giving me any choice." Listening to that recording later was like taking a punch to the gut. Betty's coldness, her willingness to go so far, it was shocking. That night, sitting alone in my room, I looked at George's photo on my bedside table. "Oh, my son," I whispered, tears silently streaming down my face. How did things get to this point? But as the pain threatened to consume me, I also felt a resolution growing within me. Betty might have her dirty tactics, but I had the truth on my side. And with Laura's help, I would make sure justice was served. "For you, George," I quietly vowed. "For everything you meant, for everything you could have been. I won't let your memory be tarnished by greed and lies." And with that promise, I steeled myself for the battle ahead. A battle I was determined to win, no matter the cost. The day of the trial finally arrived, and I found myself standing before the imposing courthouse, my hands trembling as I adjusted my black blazer. Laura was by my side, her face a mask of determination. "Are you ready for this, Barbara?" she asked softly. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I have to be, don't I? For George." We walked into the courtroom, the scent of polished wood and old paper filling my lungs. Betty was already there, sitting beside her lawyer, her face pale but resolute. Our eyes met for a moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The judge entered, and we all stood. As the proceedings began, My mind wandered to George, to the happy moments we shared, to the son I lost too soon. I was pulled back to reality by the voice of Betty's lawyer. Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Betty Thompson, was unfairly excluded from the will of her late husband, George Thompson. I heard his words as if from a distance, each lie, each distortion of the truth making my blood boil. When it was my turn to testify, I felt as though I was walking through a dream. Mrs. Barbara, can you tell us about the relationship between your son George and your daughter-in-law Betty? My lawyer asked. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all the unspoken words over the years. George loved Betty, I began, my voice trembling slightly. He loved her so much that he trusted her to take care of him when he fell ill. I paused, gathering the courage for what was to come next. But Betty betrayed him in the worst way possible. I could hear the murmurs of surprise in the courtroom. Betty's lawyer stood up abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. That's slander. The judge raised his hand. Mrs. Barbara, please explain what you mean. I felt tears burning my eyes, but I forced myself to continue. George could have been cured. The treatment was available, but Betty, she chose not to follow through. The courtroom erupted into whispers. I saw Betty's face pale even further, her eyes widening in shock. Your Honor, I continued, my voice gaining strength, I have proof, medical records, testimony from George's doctor, and this. My lawyer presented the recordings that Laura and I had made. Betty's voice echoed through the courtroom, cold and calculating, discussing falsifying documents, her greed for money. I looked directly at Betty as the recording played. Her face was a mixture of anger and defeat. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse in her eyes, but it quickly vanished. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was deafening. The judge leaned forward, his face stern. Mrs. Betty, do you have anything to say in your defense? Betty stood slowly, her legs barely holding her up. I just wanted what was rightfully mine, she stammered, her voice barely audible. I felt a wave of pity mixed with disgust. How could you, Betty? I asked, my voice breaking. How could you do this to George? She looked at me, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I didn't think... The judge interrupted, his voice firm. I think I've heard enough. This court will deliberate and announce its verdict shortly. As we left the courtroom, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Laura squeezed my hand gently. You were incredible, Barbara. George would be proud, I nodded, unable to speak. The image of George's face lingered in my mind, his gentle smile, his eyes full of love. Finally, I thought, we've done justice, my son. That night, sitting alone at home, looking at the stars through the window, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in months. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time since George's death, I felt that maybe, just maybe, I could start to heal. George, my love, I whispered to the starry sky. I hope you can rest in peace now. Mom took care of everything. The court's decision had been clear and unequivocal. Betty was completely removed from the will. The evidence of her negligence and failed attempts was overwhelming. I remember the moment the judge delivered the sentence, his voice echoing through the courtroom. In light of the evidence presented, this court finds that Mrs. Betty Thompson acted in bad faith and with gross negligence. She is therefore excluded from any right to the inheritance of Mr. George Thompson. Betty's face at that moment, I will never forget. A mixture of shock, anger, and finally defeat. When our eyes met for the last time, I saw something I never expected to see in hers. Regret. Barbara, she whispered as she passed by me. I'm sorry, but it was too late. The words hung in the air between us, a chasm that no apology could bridge. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, sadness, a sense of closure I didn't know I needed. Laura was by my side throughout the entire process, her presence a quiet comfort. Barbara, you did what needed to be done, she told me one night as we shared a cup of tea. George would be proud. I nodded, feeling the tears start to form. I just wish he were here, Laura, that none of this had happened. She took my hand, squeezing it gently. I know, dear. I know. Weeks passed, and gradually I began to feel like I could breathe again. The pain of losing George was still there, a constant echo in my heart, but it was no longer as suffocating. It was on a sunny Saturday morning that the letter arrived. The envelope was simple, but the sender's name made my heart skip a beat. Timothy Thompson, George and Betty's son, my grandson. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. Dear Grandma Barbara, I hope this letter finds you well. I know we've been through tough times and many things have been said and done. But I want you to know that despite everything, I'm grateful that you fought for the truth. My new adoptive family is wonderful and treats me with so much love. But I've never forgotten you or Dad. I wanted to thank you for everything you did, for honoring his memory the way you did. I hope that one day we can reconnect and rebuild our relationship. Until then, know that you're always in my thoughts. With love, Timmy. Tears streamed freely down my face as I read and reread the letter. My little Timmy, so mature, so understanding. I felt a mix of pride and sadness, along with a pang of guilt for not keeping in touch with him throughout this ordeal. That night, sitting in my favorite chair, Timmy's letter in one hand and a photo of George in the other, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. George, my love, I whispered to the photo, looking at the eternally frozen smile of my son. We did the right thing, and Timmy, he's okay. He understands. I closed my eyes, letting the tears fall freely. They were tears of sadness, yes, but also of relief, of closure, and perhaps, just perhaps, of a new beginning. The journey had been long and painful. I lost my son, faced betrayal, fought for justice. But in the end, the truth prevailed. And now, with Timmy's letter, I felt that perhaps there was a new chapter to be written. Tomorrow, I decided I will respond to Timmy's letter. I'll tell him about his father, about the happy moments we shared. I'll keep George's memory alive, not through bitterness or resentment, but through love and truth. And who knows, maybe one day, not too far from now, I can embrace my grandson again and see in his eyes the reflection of the son I lost. Until then, I will live each day honoring George's memory, grateful for the love we shared and the justice we achieved. And though the pain will never completely fade, I know I can now look to the future with a lighter heart and a peaceful soul. Good night, my son, I whispered, gently kissing George's photo before placing it back on the nightstand. Rest in peace. Mom took care of everything. As I prepare to sleep, I look out the window at the starry sky. Each shining star reminds me of a lesson I've learned on this painful journey. Life, I've realized, is a complex tapestry of love, loss, and redemption. Each thread, no matter how dark, has its place in the larger design. Losing George taught me the depth of a mother's love. Betty's confusion showed me the importance of truth and integrity. The legal battle reminded me that justice, though sometimes slow, can prevail. And Timmy's letter gave me the most precious gift of all, hope. I've come to understand that our story, mine, George's, Betty's, and Timmy's, is not just about loss. It's about resilience, about the strength of the human spirit to overcome adversity. It's about how, even in the darkest hours, a small light of hope can illuminate the path forward. Now, as I close this narrative, I want to speak directly to you. Yes, you who have taken the time to listen to my story. I hope it has touched your heart, made you reflect on your own relationships, on the power of forgiveness and the importance of truth. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred emotions or brought insights, I would be immensely grateful if you subscribed to this channel. Each subscription, each like, is a small flame that keeps not only my story alive, but also the stories of so many others yet to be told. When you click that subscribe button, you're not just supporting this channel. You're joining a community of people who value deep and meaningful stories. You're saying yes to more narratives that explore the complexity of the human experience. And don't forget to leave your It's a simple but powerful way to say that you want more stories like this. Every like is an encouragement, a motivation to keep sharing these narratives that connect us in our shared humanity. From my side, I want to express my deepest gratitude to you for accompanying me on this journey. Your presence, even if virtual, has brought comfort and meaning to my story. And now, with a heart full of hope and gratitude, I invite you to join me in the next story. Who knows what new adventures, what new insights await us? Let's discover them together, shall we? Until next time. And remember, no matter how difficult life may seem, there is always hope on the horizon. We just need the courage to continue our journey,